Hi, this is Lisa with Holland Designs Crochet. Today I'd like to talk to you about a magazine called Creative Fibre. It's a New Zealand publication. I'm just going through a folder that I have here of some of my magazines which have patterns of mine in them. So I've just kept a bit of a collection of some of the issues of crochet magazines where I've had a pattern published in the past. So this is an issue of Creative Fibre, and this comes out, I believe, 4 times a year, and it's a New Zealand publication. This is the September 2021 issue, and this particular issue I had a crochet pattern published, the Wonder Cable Blanket. And so this magazine is more of a newsy type magazine. It has articles and about events and artists in New Zealand, and occasionally a pattern such as the Wonder Cable Blanket that I published in this issue. And so you can subscribe to this magazine. I believe even if you're international, you can sign up to Creative Fibre. So I'll leave links in the description box if you'd be interested in finding out more about it. So I will be having another pattern coming out in an upcoming issue, and also an article coming out as well. So this video I'm making is basically to accompany some of those upcoming articles and patterns, so that those who subscribe to the magazine can also then reference this video. I was asked by Catherine, who is the editor of Creative Fibre, to provide some tips and tricks for crochet that might be helpful to someone who is a beginner or someone who is self-taught. There were a few questions that she offered to me, so I'll use some of those questions that she had and answer those in this video. For one thing, as an American living in New Zealand and as a crochet designer, I deal often with people from all around the world, different skill levels, and also those who are from different countries. So obviously Americans generally are used to crochet in standard American terms, and of course then in the UK and possibly other places such as New Zealand, there have been those who are used to the UK terms. So there are differences in crochet terms between the US and the UK. I think people are becoming more and more aware of those differences and are learning to read patterns in either language, either US or UK, simply because of the internet and the availability of crochet patterns online. So I would say, though, that it's just good to have a resource. I'll provide a link for that in the description box, but it's just one that I use often. It's called the Crafty Yarn Council, and it does have all the standard US terms available there, and crochet abbreviations, and also talks about UK terms as well. And then also provide a link to a website which provides crochet translation for other languages. So I often get questions as well from either Dutch or sometimes German or Spanish, people who need to translate a crochet pattern into their own language. So that I will definitely provide them then with that translation website. It gives a chart of different terms, and I'll also give them the standard terms in American, so that they can look at any abbreviations that might be in the pattern and look up the full definition of it on the website. So it's just great. There are a lot of those resources available online these days, so you can definitely make use of those. And of course, you can find some of that stuff in books as well. Maybe not as much of the translation terminology, but you can definitely find a lot of information in crochet books. And okay, so I'm going to just demonstrate something for you today. It was just a question that I was asked about the term top of a chain. So if you're working a round of any stitches, I'll just begin with a starting chain 3 for this example, and then form a ring with a slip stitch, and then I'll make a ring of double crochets. So for double crochet, I always just do a chain 2. I never do chain 3, even though you might see that in some patterns. I always do chain 2. I find that it gives me the height that I need and also prevents there from being a gap. So from my personal preference and as a designer, I always do a chain 2. And I'll just work a round of double crochet stitches. You might find yourself doing something like this if you are making a slipper. Sometimes if you're starting at the toe of a slipper, you might work a round of double crochet. Or even if you're starting some kind of a square for an afghan or something, you might begin with a round of double crochets. And at the end of the round, there'll usually be an instruction after you've worked all of your stitches that will say to join with a slip stitch in the top of the beginning chain 2 or chain 3. So the question was, what is the top of the beginning chain 2 or chain 3? And I'll just explain it, that it simply means the loop at the very top of that chain. So any loop at the very top of that chain that's standing there, which also is representing a double crochet, so it's a replacement for a double crochet, you're simply working a slip stitch in the top of that. And that's all that means. So it's nothing complicated, but I understand that, if you're new to crochet and you see a term top of a chain, you may not know for sure what that is, or you may think that it's something more complicated than what it is. So I've just demonstrated that for you and hopefully answered that question sufficiently. I'll demonstrate round 2. This would be an increased round where we'd be working 2 double crochets in each stitch around so that we have a nice flat circle. And to begin round 2, I'll begin with a chain 2, and that counts as the first double crochet of the round, and that would be a double crochet in the stitch count that would be given in the pattern. So chain 2 start, and then it would say double crochet in the same space. So you would simply be working into the space at the base of that beginning chain 2, very same space. So you might see that terminology. And then you would also be told to work 2 double crochets in each double crochet around, so each stitch. And so each of these double crochets, you can see, has 2 loops at the top, and they're right above and perhaps slightly to the right of the stitch. So one of the questions I was asked is which loops belong to which stitch. So if you were learning to crochet and you weren't quite sure what you're looking at, it'd be easy to think that perhaps these loops belonged to the first stitch. So just to be clear, sometimes it is hard to see. Even when you're experienced, you might get confused occasionally and say, where am I meant to be placing my hook, or where does my next stitch go? It just depends on the pattern. Sometimes you might find that something is slightly confusing. I would always recommend that you simply pay attention to the stitch count in the pattern so that you are certain that you've done it correctly. If your stitch count is correct, then you're pretty much guaranteed that your placement was correct as well. So I'll just begin working here, 2 double crochets in each double crochet around. And again, this is applying to those who are right-handed, so there are obviously differences for left-handed crocheters. I don't have any expertise in that area, so I'm not going to mention that other than to say that things might be different if you're left-handed. But for myself, I would say I find the loops of a stitch are generally on the top of the stitch or slightly to the right of the stitch of the actual post of the stitch. So that's actually called a post. The tall upright portion of the stitch is called a post. So if you're into doing textured patterns, working front post and back post stitches, you'll encounter that term as well. So there's always new terms to learn, and it just takes practice to begin to understand some of those things. And there are plenty of videos online demonstrating those things. And also that website I mentioned, the Crafty Yarn Council, it has diagrams as well, and a lot of details, a lot of information that you can read if you want to learn about different parts of a stitch. So for instance, in double crochet, you have a front loop and a back loop. You can see there's no third loop, which you would sometimes have if you're working, say, across half double crochet. You would have a third loop or a lower loop. For double crochet, you only have those 2 loops at the top. So you'd have front and back loops, and you would sometimes be told to work into a front loop or a back loop. And that would also be something that you would do to create some sort of texture in your pattern. So I'll just complete this round, again showing you how we join in the top of the beginning chain. And I'm not really paying attention to my stitch counts here. I wasn't paying any attention at all to what I was doing because I'm just making this up, but you would also want to double check your stitch count to make sure that it agreed with what was in the pattern. So you can see here at the base of this chain 2, this looks like it could possibly be a stitch, but it's not. So you would want to make sure that you knew that you would work the correct number of stitches and that you weren't accidentally placing other stitches in here. So you would simply join at the top of that beginning chain 2 to complete that round. Another question I was asked was about different hook sizes in crochet and what size to use. Often if you have a pattern, it will tell you what size yarn and what size hook to use. And again, on the Crafty Yarn Council website, there are standards for yarn sizes, so you can learn about that information as well. Different terms between US and UK. So in the UK, often a yarn is referred to by plies. So for instance, this would be known as a 8-ply yarn, or a DK weight, which stands for double knit. In America or USA, it would be termed a size 3 yarn, and you would see that on the yarn label. Or also it would be known as a light worsted weight yarn, and so that refers to the width or the thickness of the strand versus how many plies it is. So this is just an 8-ply that I'm using here to demonstrate for you. So if you're using this size yarn, you could definitely vary the hook size just depending on the pattern you're using or the type of garment or item you're making. If you're doing like a amigurumi pattern or a toy and you're just working in single crochet, you're going to want to use a smaller hook to create more tightly knit stitches. If you're doing a blanket, you might be told to use a larger hook to create more of a lacy, lightweight effect. So obviously the size of the hook, it will change the size of your stitches. So larger hook will give you larger stitches, and lacier fabric blankets with a better drape. So you also can choose hook size based on your own personal gauge. So if you know that you are someone who crochets more loosely, you can feel free to use a smaller hook to try and tighten up your stitches. And the same being said, if you are someone who crochets more densely or more tightly, you can use a larger hook to make your stitches looser. So you can definitely vary that. And sometimes I will recommend a pattern. In one of my own patterns, I'll recommend a hook size that seems too large for the pattern, but it is the one I've used in the sample, and it is the one I've intentionally used to create the effect that I wanted. So you don't always need to go by the recommended hook size on the yarn label, but you can definitely trust the designer generally that the hook given in the pattern is the one that you would want to use. So this hook here is a size F, also a 3.75 millimeter in UK terms, I suppose. They often use millimeters versus letters. This hook I've had since I was 10 years old, so it's quite worn. It would have originally been more of a darker blue color. And yeah, I've had it since I was 10, so you can see I've used it quite a bit, and it is still one of my favorite hooks. I do like using an F hook, especially if I'm making toys. This is a favorite hook of mine as well. This is a K hook, or a 6.5 millimeter. I use this one quite a bit as well. And I would use this with a heavier yarn, probably if I'm making a blanket. This hook doesn't have a size on it, I don't believe, but this is an H hook, or a 5 millimeter, and this one was hand carved for me out of peach wood and made by an elderly bachelor that I knew here in New Zealand for a while, and he was a wood turner, self-taught. So he made this hook for me custom after I asked him to see if he could make crochet hooks, and he did a few samples for me and finally came up with an amazing hook. So I do have this one I use as well, but it's just a personal hook that isn't really available commercially. So that's really special to me as well. So yes, definitely feel free to use a hook size of choice and also a hook brand that you prefer. Some of them have different, the shape of the hook can be a little bit different, so might want to see what kind of hooks you like. These are all boy hooks, I believe, and I also have some other ones. There's plenty of other hooks around, hook brands and things, so you can get generic ones. You can also just get, like, Susan Bates is another brand. And there's some really expensive ones as well, so you might become a collector of yarn, of hooks and of yarn. I'm going to just demonstrate for you the concept of lower loops, or working into lower loops only. So I'm just working a short swatch here, a row of half double crochet. And so half double crochet has 3 loops that are visible on the wrong side of the stitch as you're working back across. So I've just got my short row here of half double crochets, and I will do a chain 1 and turn. And so on this side of the stitch that's facing now that we've turned, this is the wrong side of the half double crochets. You can very visibly see 2 loops on the face of your work there, but the actual top of the stitch is at the top of the row, and you can see there's 2 loops visible when you look at it that way. So the top of the stitch has the 2 loops, which would be typically referred to as the front and the back loop, and on the face of the stitch is this lower loop. It's also been referred to as a third loop, so I've seen other designers refer to it as a third loop. I refer to it as a lower loop. So you have a front and back loop on the top and a lower loop on the face of your work. And so in a pattern, sometimes it'll tell you to work into the back loop only. Sometimes it will tell you to work into the front loop only. And in the case of some of the patterns that have appeared in Creative Fibre, lower loop only, which is this lower one below the front loop on the face of your work. So I will just demonstrate again. So lower loop here on the face of your work, which is right below the 2 top loops, the front and back loop on the top of the stitch. So once you find that and you get used to working in it, it's pretty simple to see and understand. And also, to help you see loops clearly, make sure you're using a large enough hook, that your stitches are not too tight, and also that you're using a color of yarn that is light enough so you can see the stitches and see the loops. So obviously you don't want to work in a really dark color, just so that you can help yourself as you're learning. We need to be able to see what you're doing. And again, pay attention to the stitch count so that you know where to place your last stitch of the row. The last lower loop might be just a little bit hard to see or to be confident about the placement, but that doesn't really matter so much. As long as you have the correct stitch count, you'll know that you have it correct there at the end of the row. And then again, you would chain 1 and turn, and you can see how we've created a bit of a ribbed texture here. And then if I was to go ahead and work into back loops only on this row, then you can see how the sort of a double line of ribbing begins to appear on the front of that work. So working into the back loops puts the ribbing on the front of your work, as so. Working into lower loops puts the ribbing on the back of your work. So alternating working into back loops or front loops is what will create the ribbed texture that I've used in some patterns. For instance, this one here, which will be appearing in an upcoming issue of Creative Fibre. This is the Merino Lover's Beanie. This one is a very simple pattern, and it has, it's worked in a multicolored yarn, so a little bit more difficult to see the ribbing because of the beautiful colors here of this merino. But I also used a lower loop and back loop only technique to create ribbing. So I had lines of three ribbed rows together, and on the inside you could see the same effect. We had like 2 rows of ribbing on the inside and 3 on the outside. So sets of 3, and on the inside sets of 2. So it's quite interesting how you can use some of these crochet stitches to create a knit look design, which was my intention, to create a knit look fabric or knit look texture with crochet stitches. So for those of us who cannot knit or are not very confident with knitting, it's really fun to be able to create knit look textures with crochet. And half double crochet is one of those stitches that is really easy to use to create knit look textures. So I hope that you find that interesting and useful. And also you can use the same sort of a technique of a lower loop only with another stitch, which is called a half double slip stitch. And you can find that also demonstrated online, but I'll just show you very quickly. A half double slip stitch is a lower or shorter stitch than a half double crochet. A half double crochet has three loops. 1, 2, 3. Yarn over, pull through all those 3. A half double slip stitch is instead yarn over, insert your hook, yarn over, pull up a loop, so you only have those 3 loops again, but you do not yarn over after that, so you just simply pull that straight through those 2 loops, and that's a shorter stitch called a half double slip stitch. It's often used in ribbing. I use it a lot of times on ribbed edgings for my blankets or garments. So it's a tighter, lower stitch, but it also has the same exact effect of 3 loops that you can then work into either front, back, or lower loop. In the article I wrote for Creative Fibre, I mentioned that my mother was a Jill of all trades. So she was able to knit and crochet and sew, both by hand and using a treadle sewing machine. She wasn't what I would say an expert in any of those things, but she was competent enough to be able to do what she needed to do for her own family or for her own personal life, and also teach those skills to her daughters. She also was a great baker, and she was a good cook, and she passed those skills on to me as well. So when I was about 3 years old, it was the first time that I held a crochet hook, and I learned to make a chain. So my hands were obviously quite small at that time, and I was told that my hands were too small to hold the hook, and that my older sister, she would be able to do it because she was 5 years old, but that I was too little. But I definitely said, give me that crochet hook, give me that yarn, I can do it. And to the surprise of my mother and my elder sister, who was there as well teaching, they said, oh, she can do it. So that was the beginning of my crochet career. Of course, now I've been working professionally full-time as an independent crochet designer for approximately 16 years. So my eldest daughter is going to be turning 16, and I started to work from home as a stay-at-home mom, designing crochet patterns and selling them on Etsy and other online websites when Holland was just a baby. So that's where the name of my business comes from. I named it after her. So that's where Holland Designs Crochet had its humble beginnings when I was 3 years old. So I also have passed on some basic crochet skills to my own daughters. So I have 3 daughters as well, and I've taught them, of course, baking as well, and other things that my mother would have taught me. But crochet is just something that they know some basics of. I haven't forced any of them to like develop a real interest in it unless they choose to. I let them have their own interests, whether it's sports or playing piano or drawing. They can do the things that they find joy in. And my youngest daughter has really had more of an interest in crochet, and she has made some toys for gifts for her friends or for herself. She has learned to read patterns a little bit. She uses YouTube videos as well to learn to read patterns, and she also finds other patterns online for free sometimes, or she designs her own even, as I've taught her some basics of design for like toys. So I have filmed a short video of her today as well. I'm going to share that with you here at the end of this video. And so Adelaide's 11, and she's been crocheting for maybe a year and has learned some of the basics, and she definitely has a great beginning and she can continue to develop her skills as she gets older and as she has interest in doing so. This is Adelaide. She's 11 and she likes to crochet sometimes. She's makes her own little amigurumi patterns sometimes. And Adelaide, you want to tell me what you've been doing this morning with your hook and yarn?
I have this horse, and it's a Palomino horse, and it's from the Generation Dolls. And when I got it, didn't have a halter or anything, so I decided to make one, and I made it in black, and I put it on like that, then it goes around its ears, around its muzzle, and then I bring that around. So it's like a bridle.
You just made that with some yarn and a crochet hook, huh?
Mm-hmm. And then I've only made one, but I'm making these little leg warmers. Yeah.
So that's a really great way to have a lot of fun with a new toy, but also make like clothes for your horse. And are you going to make anything else for it?
Yeah, I'm gonna finish making the leg warmers, and then gonna make a saddle blanket, and then maybe a saddle.
Okay, I love it. It looks great. Thanks for sharing that with me today.